Hello, welcome. My name's Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to edition 95 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. Today, we're going to be talking about the pitfalls of accounting for intentional adulteration in your food safety plan with Earl Arnold from AIB International. But before we meet Earl, just a couple of things. I've loaded in the sidebar a attendee webinar checklist. Please have a look at that file if you are having problems. It gives you the best practice and things to do so that you can watch and listen to this webinar and get the best out of it. So please do download that file and have a look. Also, obviously, a lot of you regulars are already commenting in the sidebar saying good morning, hello from wherever you are. You're all welcome. Just type your comments, get to know each other, and type your questions. We'll highlight those and we'll pick those up at the end of the webinar. So welcome everybody, nice to have you with us. And Earl, are you with us? I hope you are. Hi. Microphone.
There we go.
Yeah. Hi Earl, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing today, Simon?
Fantastic. Where are you calling in from, Earl?
I'm calling in from a balmy Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas. And I'm calling in from, actually, it's quite warm and sunny in Manchester, England as well. So, yeah, lovely. We're both basking in sunshine. Okay, if you'd like to get your slides ready, Earl, I'll just tell the audience about next week's upcoming webinar, and then we'll get going. Okay.
Perfect.
Right, you'll see in the sidebar a picture of George Howlett from Safe Food 360, and the webinar is Understanding the Link Between Hazard, Risk and Control. So that's next Friday at 3 p.m. Before I move on, I'm just going to thank the sponsors of the Food Safety Fridays webinars, or else none of us would be here. They are Safe Food 360, Trace Analytics, Mettler Toledo, DNVGL, and AIB International. And on that note, I'll leave it to Earl from AIB International. I'll be back later.
Excellent. All right, well, good morning, everybody. So today we're going to be discussing the pitfalls of combining the food safety plans and food defense plans together. At first glance, this seems like it might be a great idea. However, we're going to discuss during this presentation the reasons why you might not want to do this. During this training, we're going to discuss the pitfalls of combining the food safety and food defense plans. We'll discuss the general requirements for the food safety plan and the food safety plan, and we'll cover some of the similarities and differences that these plans contain. We'll also cover the differences in methodologies used to complete either the hazard analysis or the vulnerability assessment so that we understand our responsibilities and requirements. Next, we're going to discuss the records requirements for both plans, and last, we'll look at the reasons why we might not want to combine these two programs together. So here is our first question that we want to find out if you guys know. So from your current understanding, what are some of the similarities between the food safety and food defense plans that we have to put together, whether we're talking about the FDA requirements or the GFSI requirements?
Okay, ladies and gents, you know how to type in the sidebar. Yeah, so what do you think some of the similarities between the food safety and food defense plans might be? A little test of knowledge to make sure you're awake. So yeah, do type in. If anybody is having a problem, remember, look at the checklist and then follow the best practice in there, and that you shouldn't have any problems. Okay, Pauline, we have to conduct a risk analysis. Brandy, searching for risks and how to address them. Perimeter security, Fran. Both must be documented and must include a risk analysis. Brooke, plant access, Jim. Food safety, unintentional adulteration. Ernest, conducting a hazard analysis. Emil, identify how an employee may adulterate a product. Sherry, risk assessment. Ilaria, both risk-based, to be documented. Required by FDA, require hazard analysis and control measures. Proactivity versus planning. prevention, SOVROM.
So all of those are some really good examples, and your guys are right for the most part. Here is some similarities. So like you guys were saying, both do require some sort of an assessment. For the food safety plan, we call it a hazard analysis. For food defense, we call it a vulnerability assessment. Both of them require some preventative measures for those significant issues we identified during those risk assessments or hazard analysis. So for the food safety plan, we kind of call those preventative controls or critical control points underneath the HACCP requirements. And then for the food defense plan, we call those mitigation strategies. Both plans require these things to be conducted by trained and qualified personnel. Both are supported by prerequisite programs, like somebody mentioned, secured perimeter. So that's a good prerequisite program for food defense. And, say washing hands after we go on break is a good prerequisite for the food safety plans. Now, both also require, if we identify significant risks, to monitor them, to develop corrective actions, and to conduct verification activities. So it seems like we have a really smart class here today, Simon.
Always, Earl, always.
So now we're going to go with an overview of the food safety plan. So as you can see on the screen, the food safety plan is 21 CFR 117. That's the FDA's regulatory requirement. The title is Current Good Manufacturing Practices and Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventative Controls for Human Food. With some exceptions, this rule applies to both domestic and foreign companies that are required to register with the FDA. And then on the next slide, we're going to look at some of the exemptions, so the people that don't have to comply with this. So it's also important to note that this part of the regulation also covers new GMPs. So in the past, the regulatory GMPs were in 21 CFR 110, but when your compliance date hit, you're now required to follow the ones that are found in subpart B of this regulation, and there have been some enhancements from the old to the new. Now, compliance dates for when you had to be ready for this rule is for very small businesses, you had 3 years to comply with this regulation, which means that September of this year, you need to be ready for being in compliant with this regulation. For small businesses, you had 2 years to comply, and you needed to be compliant last year. And then for the larger companies, you had to be in compliance 1 year after the rule was written. Now, exemptions. If you were a facility that's supposed to fall underneath USDA regulated products, then you do not have to follow the preventive controls rule requirements. If you're considered a qualified facility, which means basically that you met that requirement for a very small business, which is basically you don't make more than $1 million annually for 3 years consecutively in a row, and that includes all products you still have in stock plus what you sold. If you meet that requirement, then you only have to follow a very limited amount of what this regulation requires. If you're required to fall underneath regulated fish or fishery products, then you're going to follow that. If you're required to follow HACCP, either juice or seafood, then you don't have to comply with this regulation. If you are following the low acid canned foods regulation, then you don't have to do the full-blown procedures in here. You would not have to account for microbial hazards, but you would still need to focus on the physical, chemical, radiological, and economically motivated adulteration. If you produce or hold on to dietary supplements, you will follow that regulation and not this one. And then if you're considered a farm, and if you produce alcoholic beverages, in most cases, you won't have to follow this rule. And if you hold fully enclosed foods that are not exposed to the environment, then you'll have to follow the modified requirements if you maintain temperature for food safety. If you don't, then you're exempt from the rule altogether. Now, a little bit of what the regulation covers, which is these following subparts. Subpart A really focuses on just basics of the regulation. It gives you who's applicable to this regulation. It gives you a list of definitions and what those meanings are. It talks about qualifications of individuals, and it also has in there who needs to comply with the regulations and what are the exemptions. Subpart B is the new GMP requirements that I mentioned earlier. So it's got some updates. Basically, one of the major ones is that it brings in cross-contamination as a new term, or cross-contact as a new term, meaning that allergens accidentally being introduced into the supply system. Subpart C talks about everything you need to do for the hazard analysis. Subpart D is those modified requirements I mentioned. So if I'm considered a very small business, I would follow these. Or also, if I'm a warehouse and all I do is hold fully enclosed products, but I do have temperature control for food safety, then I would follow the modified requirements in here. Subpart E talks about if I do bad things, what's going to happen to me, meaning that I'd lose my qualified status. Subpart F covers all the records requirements for this rule, so what I have to do and how the records need to look. And then the last part is the supply chain program. So I need to ensure that if I have anything important dealing with food safety that my supplier is going to control, I need to include that within my food safety program. Now, in overview, like I mentioned, you need to have your updated GMPs. And you want to make sure that if you haven't, take a good look at these new changes within the program, which is basically, like I mentioned, they added in the new term, allergen cross-contact. The significance of this is it is mentioned over 24 times within the new GMP requirements. So you really want to make sure that you're focusing on how you control allergens within your facility. The other things that were included was they changed terminology like the word using must to shall. And then they also did include in there requirements that you might need to clean non-food contact surfaces more often to prevent that potential allergen issue. They also have the requirements in there of what the hazard analysis what the hazard analysis looks like. It is similar to a HACCP analysis that we've been doing probably since the 60s in the food industry, which basically requires you to look at the following contaminants: chemical, biological, radiological, and physical. The last one that we need to include in this program is also economically motivated adulteration from the FDA's requirements, which basically means food fraud that could lead to a food safety issue, such as melamine in milk products or peanut residue in cumin that was added in there on purpose to help increase the yield. It also requires us that when we did our hazard analysis, if we had significant hazards, then we needed to implement preventative controls. The possible preventative controls that we can implement are process preventative controls, allergen preventative controls, sanitation preventative controls, and supply chain preventative controls. And the last one is any others that we see fit. Could be maybe a maintenance preventative control or something like that. If we have a preventative control, then we need to develop management components that shows that we are controlling it. And this is going to be the monitoring, the corrective actions, and the verification activities. For food safety, if we have preventative controls, then we must have a documented recall plan. And then, of course, have all the records that are going to support what we do in our food safety plan. So pretty cut and dry, and I know most of you already know this information. Now we're going to switch over to the requirements in the food defense plan. So the official regulation name for food defense is 21 CFR 121, which is mitigation strategies to protect food from against intentional adulteration. And this regulation was published on May 27th, 2016, and it comes effective for those very large facilities next year. So May of 2019. This rule or regulation only focuses on intentional adulteration, whereas the food safety regulation focuses on accidental contamination or adulteration. Now, One thing to capture here too is the definitions of a small business, very small business, and other than small and very small are a little bit different. So FDA's definition of a very small business is generating annually under $10 million for 3 consecutive years, to include product we may still have in stock, instead of the $1 million. So there is a slight difference. The definition of small business is the same, which is basically having under 500 full-time employees. Now, the exemptions for the food defense plan you're going to see are also similar to the food safety plan. If I follow USDA regulated products, then I fall underneath that regulation. If I'm considered a very small business, I'm relatively exempt from the regulation. I'm considered a qualified facility, and so I only have to let FDA know that, hey, I do have a vulnerability assessment. I am following some format, but I don't necessarily have to have the full-blown program that we're going to cover in a minute. If all I do am a business that holds food, and that food is fully enclosed, and it's not exposed to the environment, I don't necessarily have to have a regulated food defense program. The only difference is if I am holding on to bulk liquids. Now, FDA's perspective of bulk liquids is not barrels, totes, or buckets. It's large tanks with huge amounts of liquid. If I am a facility that packages, repackages, and I'm exposing that primary product to the environment, then I need to follow the rule. But if I'm not, if all I'm doing is taking different flavored waters from individual packages and combining it like into a multi-pack, and I'm not exposing the product to the environment, then I'm exempt from having this regulated food defense program. Additionally, if I'm a farm, then I follow the produce safety rule requirements. If I'm in beverage facility, then I'm going to follow those requirements underneath the state treasury or other applicable regulations. Additionally, if I'm a facility that produces animal food or animal feed, I'm exempted from this regulation. And last but not least, on-farm manufacturing, such as eggs and game meats and those kind of things, those types of facilities are exempted from the rule as well. Now, the regulation breakdown for the food defense is basically subpart A, again, similar to the food safety plan, where it has who needs to comply with the regulation, the definitions that are covered within the regulation so we understand what those terms are, and it also includes exemptions from the rule. Subpart B is totally blank right now. They do have it there, but they're holding it in case they need to add something new into the future. Subpart C talks about all the requirements for the vulnerability assessment and what we need to do for this regulation. Subpart D talks about the records requirements, and Subpart E talks about compliance and failure with compliance. Now, here is our next poll question. So, and we're kind of focusing on the food defense requirements, but what is meant by a significant vulnerability? So what do you guys think?
Yep. Yep. What is a significant vulnerability? As I've seen, an egg pasteurization facility is exempt of the rule. Right. Right. Brooke, any vulnerability that could result in harm to the consumer. That's not a bad start. Risk likely to occur, adulterated products, outdoor sales, SMTH under a greater risk food products, milk powder coming from China, high risk, high opportunity, no food safety plan. A step in the process that, if exploited, could reasonably expected to cause wide-scale public harm. I just managed to grab that one as it went past. My word. Not implemented HACCP plan properly, one which could cause widespread harm. I think I've probably, well, the audience have mentioned it. They've captured it, I think, haven't they?
Absolutely, they have. So the definition out of the regulation is a vulnerability, if exploited, could cause wide-scale public health harm. Now, keeping that in mind, You can also even use this and say, what is a significant hazard? Because you're looking for that in a food safety plan, and it's basically the same thing. Really what you're doing is looking for that issue or that problem, whether you're looking at food safety or food defense, for where in my processing step could a significant hazard happen that could lead to a class 1 recall or people getting sick or hurt or dying. And that's both for food defense or food safety. So great answer, guys. Now, the overview of the food defense plan says that I need to conduct a vulnerability assessment. If I have a vulnerability assessment and identify a significant vulnerability, then I'm required to develop mitigation strategies. And if I have mitigation strategies, then I have to develop those management components, which are called food defense monitoring, food defense corrective actions, and food defense verification. I'm then required to have records to support my whole entire program. So as you can see, it's a little bit, at least on the screen, appears just a little bit less than what the food safety plan is requiring. So now what I want to discuss is the similarities between the two requirements. Now, I know initially I was talking about the regulatory requirements. However, all of you are very familiar and probably follow some sort of GFSI scheme as well. So whether it's BRC, FSSC, SQF, or others, most of you are aware that those new changes that have been added in, and I'll give an example of FSSC's version 4.1 that asks facilities to develop a food defense threat assessment. The requirements of what they're asking for and what the FDA regulation is asking for are very similar as well. Not identical, but the requirements that they're looking for are pretty similar. In fact, those of you that are following the FSSC scheme might have seen a couple of weeks ago those guidance documents that they brought out that actually even references being able to use the FDA's Food Defense Plan Builder to help you cover those requirements. So even though we're kind of discussing FDA requirements here, this does fit if you're following a GFSI scheme and maybe don't even have to follow the FDA requirements. Now, similarities. So in both plans, the training requirements are similar. You basically need to have those 4 levels of training for either the food safety or food defense. However, the training is a little bit different. But in food safety and food defense, we need to have that top trained individual, whether you're considered a preventative controls qualified individual or an individual that can conduct or oversee the development of the vulnerability assessment. So that's your top tier level of training. Someone has to be qualified to conduct that hazard analysis or vulnerability assessment. The next level of training that you're going to want to have is the training for your supervisors and managers. More than likely, in your facilities, these individuals are going to be the ones that are going to be doing your corrective actions, your verification activities, and might have oversight of more than just one preventative control or mitigation strategy. So their training will need to be a little bit more than your associates or your full-time employees, but not as extensive as that preventative control qualified individual or the one that's doing the vulnerability assessment. The next level of training is that person doing that job. So if you have a preventative control, say conducting a metal detector, then that person needs to be specifically trained on how to do that task and what to do if there's a failure. And that could be as simple as, I got to call a manager. Same thing for a mitigation strategy. If I've identified a deviation in that plan, or if I'm doing that task, like say checking seals on a bulk liquid tanker so that I can ensure that contamination or adulteration did not occur during transport, then I need to be trained on that task and what I'm supposed to do. The last level of training that we need to cover is everyone in the facility has to be trained in general food safety awareness as well as general food defense awareness training. So the requirements for training are very similar between both plans. The assessment is similar, meaning that we have to complete an assessment whether we're doing food safety or food defense. So we have to do a hazard analysis and look at likelihood and severity for those contaminants, and food defense requires you to do the same thing. Like I mentioned earlier, if we have a significant hazard or a significant vulnerability, then we need to develop mitigation strategies or preventative controls. And this part's similar too. We got to develop our preventative measures. And these are going to look different from facility to facility because they're supposed to be facility specific. If we have those preventative measures, then we have to have those monitoring, corrective actions, and verification activities. And the requirements are similar, but there are some differences that we'll talk on the next slide. In general, records requirements are almost identical between the two plans, but there are a major key difference that we'll talk about on the next slide. Both plans have to be reviewed on a certain specified frequency. From the FDA standpoint, at a minimum, you have to review both plans every 3 years in their entirety. There are some ORs, meaning that there might be conditions where you need to review it more frequently than that, but it's stipulated that at a minimum, it has to be every 3 years. Additionally, once we complete our food safety or food defense plans, they're required to be signed by the senior-most person in that facility. Once we complete it, and anytime there's a change, so this requirement between both plans are the same. And last, we're going to have those prerequisite programs that support our food safety and food defense. So, and even in some cases, the same prerequisite programs will support both programs. For instance, we'll talk about our hand washing procedure. Hand washing after coming back from a break or going and utilizing the restroom are both important for food safety and food defense. From a food safety side, it's just, oh, I might have accidentally contaminated my hands, so I want to make sure I wash them in the proper manner before I go back and act and start touching product or whatever. From a food defense perspective, it's also a good idea because of the fact that if I don't wash my hands and I'm the kind of person that's looking to try to do something bad, I can do something so easy as intentionally contaminating my hands with whatever. It could be a microbe of some sort, or even just allergens. Like, say maybe I had peanut butter for lunch and I put it all over my hands, don't wash it, and now I'm going to go touch product, and that allergen might be able to be intentionally transferred to a product somewhere. So that's just an example of how a prerequisite program can support both programs. Now, the differences in these are kind of really drastic. So the first one is the assessment. On the assessment, for the food safety plan, it's pretty basic, meaning we just have to look at those contaminants, and then when we're going through our processing steps, look at likelihood and severity if that issue may or may not occur. That's all we're required to do. And most of the time, the hazard analysis that we conduct is a HACCP style hazard analysis, and there's no different options to choose from to do that. The management components are also completely different. The food safety plan calls out those 4 or 5 potential preventative controls, and there are some prescriptive requirements if we have them. For instance, if we have a process preventative control, like say the metal detector, or even say temperature requirements, like we're going to ensure that a product gets to a certain temperature, we also have to validate those preventative controls, meaning we have to pull out that scientific information that really shows that if I do get it to that temperature, it will kill that microbe that I'm worried about. Or my metal detector really will scientifically detect those sizes that I'm worried about that could lead to food safety. For food defense, there's no requirements for validating anything. Yes, verification has to occur, but validation does not. Records are going to be very similar, but there are some major differences. The major key one is food safety. For those of you that may or may not be aware, if you have to show them to the FDA, any records that they take out of your facility are potentially available to the public due to the public disclosure laws. So in all honesty, in some cases, I could write up to the FDA and say, hey, can I see the food safety records you've gathered for XYZ facility? And if they have them, they might have to share them. Food defense is going to be totally different. The FDA recognizes that you're developing this plan, and these mitigation strategies you may have employed is how you're trying to stop a bad person from doing something bad on purpose. So these records in the food defense plan are not going to be shared with the public. They will not be part of the public disclosure laws. How you review the plan, there are a few differences. So the minimum is the same. However, there's one major difference between the two. One of the ORs, meaning the other time you might need to review your food defense plan, is if FDA tells you to. Now, this one's a pretty big one because people really don't understand what this means. FDA has a lot of great contacts, and they have a close relationship with the security agencies in the United States. So if, for instance, the FBI or Homeland Security would receive a credible threat on, say, an ingredient being contaminated or a facility being targeted, they would actually reach out to that facility or facilities that are dealing with those things and give you that information and heads up saying, hey, you might want to look at your food defense plan because here's all the information we have. You may be a target, or the ingredient you're handling is a target. So if you do get that call, it's very important that you do take a look at your plan again and make sure that it's as tight as it can be. Now, for the recall plan, the only one of the programs that requires to have a recall plan is the food safety one. So food defense does not stipulate that if you have a mitigation strategy, you have to have a recall plan. The major difference between the two is the methodology and the thought process behind conducting the assessments. Food safety is accidental, and we've been doing this since the beginning of food safety regulations and the following of the GFSI schemes. This is in our blood. This is what we do every day. We look for those accidental contamination issues. Intentional adulteration, in the context that the FDA and the new GFSI regulations are asking for, is drastically different. In the past, we used to utilize things like, oh, I got a perimeter fence, I have cameras on the outside, my doors are locked, so bad people can't get in and I'm really good. The requirements for food defense now, or at least the regulatory ones coming up, or the GFSI ones, is drastically different. You need to look at your processing steps and determine how can someone do something bad. So where is product exposed to the environment? What can I do to reach out and touch it and add something bad, and do it where you won't catch me? This is a total different thought process from accidental, that if you maybe add it into the food safety plan, you're going to miss that. If you have the same groups of people doing both assessments, you might miss that concept. And last but not least, prerequisite programs. So I kind of gave an idea on the similarities of where there are going to be some prerequisite programs that will support both food defense and food safety. But there are going to be prerequisite programs that are going to be totally different, that maybe right now you don't think of them in that way. For instance, as I go and develop my food defense plan, I might utilize locks or locked doors as a potential mitigation strategy, so that nobody can get into a room unless they're authorized to. However, that mitigation strategy will only be as good as my key control program is. So I'm going to have a well-developed prerequisite program on how I control keys in my facility to limit access to them. For instance, if I have 5 keys to my chemical storage room and I'm only issuing them out to 5 people, I should have good documents that shows that I've issued them out to these 5 people, that they're acknowledging that they got them, and I periodically inventory to make sure they have those same 5 keys and haven't made copies of them. If we don't control keys good in our facility, then we don't really have a good mitigation strategy. So an example of how there are going to be different prerequisite programs that we either may have to develop or review, that's going to be different than we would normally have in our food safety programs. Now, when it comes to methodologies, like I mentioned, when we're doing the food safety plan hazard analysis, there's basically only one, and that's the HACCP style of an assessment. When it comes to food defense, there is a list of potential methodologies we can use as long as we capture the basic requirements. So for food safety, we can do the HACCP style. We just need to consider those contaminants, which is biological, chemical, physical, radiological, and economically motivated adulteration. We identify those hazards and assess just the likelihood and severity if that event would occur. And we're looking at, is control required? So if we have a significant hazard, then we need to go ahead and implement some kind of control based on that risk rating that we gave it during our assessment. Pretty cut and dry because we've been doing this for a very long time. The FDA even helped us out because they created a food safety plan builder software system that you can download and use standalone, and it captures all those requirements. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that, you might want to consider it because it's really good. It's actually, I'm so surprised that a government agency came out with a very good program. It always doesn't happen that way. For food defense, as you can see on my little pun on the slide, it's the wild, wild west. There's no true defined methodology. In fact, the FDA says you just need to use an approved methodology, and they give you some examples, but they're not cut and dry. So one that gets mentioned a lot is CARVER plus Shock. And we're going to talk about this individually in the next few slides, these actual methodologies. Another one is operational risk management. And yes, it's mentioned in the preamble of the regulation for food defense, but we can use a HACCP or HARP-C style assessment. And we can also use the key activity types as part of our assessment, and there's many more. Now, the CARVER plus Shock, the goal is to identify critical nodes that are the most likely targets for intentional adulteration. CARVER plus Shock results in targeting conclusions that are consistent with those high-risk vulnerabilities. And it augments because processes or allows identification of either economic or psychological impact through that shock factor. Now, CARVER plus Shock is an acronym, and it fits these following 7 attributes. So when you're doing the assessment using CARVER plus Shock, it hits these 7 nodes. So it covers criticality, it covers accessibility, it covers recuperability, so how fast can you recover after an event, and not just focused on the facility, but also on the individual's health that might have been affected. It covers the vulnerability of that critical node, what would be the effect if that event occurred, and then the recognizability of the company or that processing step, and last, the shock factor, which covers in that financial or backlash maybe on your brand if there would be an issue. Now, originally, CARVER plus Shock was developed by the military and utilized for those types of events so that it could capture, before they did something, what would occur. But the regulators in food safety have kind of hijacked this assessment because it's really detailed and factors into food safety parameters. In fact, before USDA developed these regulatory requirements, they conducted several hundred vulnerability assessments using this CARVER plus Shock system on farm to fork ingredients and facilities. And that's how they came across the requirements of the regulation and also the key activity types that we're going to talk about in a few slides from now. Another approved methodology is the operational risk management system. It's a 6-step sequence that allows you to increase operational effectiveness by looking at and anticipating hazards and reducing the potential for loss. The purpose is to minimize risks to acceptable levels and being able to do this proportional to whatever your accomplishments are. As you can see in the next slide, here are the 6 actual steps. So step 1 is you need to identify the hazard. So an example could be, I'm going to look at how could contamination occur at my bulk liquid tanker receiving process. Step 2 is I'm going to assess the risks. So I'm going to rate the risk for the 3 required elements. So food defense is prescriptive from the regulatory standpoint, where it says, I need to assess these 3 things. The ability to contaminate. So how likely can someone do it? Like, is it located in an isolated area, or are there nearby chemicals or contaminants that could be used intentionally with an easy grasp? The second element is the accessibility of the product. So you're looking at how can I reach out and touch product? So do I have a tank, and is the lid locked and secured, or is it just wide open to the environment? And the third one is public health impact. So if I added a contaminant at this processing step, what would be the impact? Would a lot of people get sick? Would a lot of product be affected? Those kind of things. So for step 2, when you're assessing the risk, you would just need to demonstrate how you looked at those 3 elements. But you can analyze potential control measures like placing on seals or conducting inspections or even doing testing. And then step 4 is you're going to make those control decisions. So you might come up with 3 or 4 potential mitigation strategies, but in step 4, you're going to actually pick the best one that fits for your facility. Step 5 is you're going to implement those controls. And then step 6 is you're going to supervise and change as needed based upon your findings. Now, this is an example of a HACCP style assessment that covers the requirements of the vulnerability assessment as the FDA dictates it. So as you can see on the left-hand side of this, you have your contaminants listed. So biological, chemical, physical, radiological, because that's what you're required to evaluate during food defense. You can see there that I have a place to rate based on likelihood and severity, the degree of physical access to a product, the ability to contaminate, and the public health impact, and a place where I can give my overall vulnerability ranking, and is it an actionable process step, or have I identified a significant vulnerability? So just another type of a methodology that could be utilized. The next one, that I guess I don't have a slide for it, so I'll cover it really quickly. The FDA, like I mentioned, did those vulnerability assessments, hundreds of them. When they did those, they always came out with 4 key processing steps that were always considered high risk. Those included bulk liquid receiving and unloading, bulk liquid storage, secondary ingredient handling, and mixing and blending activities. So FDA says that you can take those 4 processing steps and, utilizing your flow diagram you have for your facility, compare these 4 key steps to what you have in your flow diagram. And if you have similar activities, then those would be considered your significant vulnerabilities where you had needed to implement controls. Now, in my personal opinion, I think this type of methodology could be misleading and might make us miss some things that we normally might not have observed during an assessment. But it is an authorized methodology of conducting a vulnerability assessment. Now, the pitfalls. What are the dangers of combining both of these plans? So if we do and include both together, as we've seen, yes, there are some similarities, but there are some major differences too as well. So although the food safety and food defense plan requirements are similar, there are major differences. When combining plans, you very well could miss some of the requirements for one or both plans, such as capturing the 3 specific elements in the food defense plan assessment: public health impact, accessibility, and ability to contaminate, or not capturing economically motivated adulteration in the food safety plan, as well as the differences in the verification requirements, such as for food safety, you need to verify all documents within 7 working days, and in food defense, you just need to verify documents on your own defined frequency that you've put into your plan. Those are just a few examples of the different requirements. Now, as we discussed, the training aspect is similar. However, the methodologies used to conduct these assessments is vastly different. A PCQI leading the food safety team would focus on food safety, which probably comes natural. However, the qualified individual to conduct or oversee the development of the vulnerability assessment will think differently, and this will take training and education to think like a criminal and think intentional versus accidental. Combining the plan could potentially allow you to miss hazards or vulnerabilities. Like I mentioned earlier, your food defense plan will state how you will prevent intentional adulteration. So sharing this plan with those that do not need to see it could put you at risk. If you combine your plans, and a third-party auditor or customer will now have access to those vulnerabilities and mitigation strategies you have implemented to reduce the potential that intentional adulteration would occur. For food safety, we want everyone to know how we're going to control accidental food safety hazards. For food defense, we don't want people to know how they can contaminate our product. Remember those public disclosure laws I mentioned earlier? If you combine both plans, these documents and/or records may not be able to be separated, now leaving it possible for the public to obtain these elements of your food defense plan and increasing your risk of intentional adulteration at the facility. As an auditor and food safety professional, I can see the attraction of combining both plans. Our time and resources are very limited. Many of the members to assist the development of the food defense and food safety plan might even be same members. However, as an auditor and food defense expert, I see the pitfalls of combining them. In my opinion, having them remaining two distinct separate plans will protect your company and allow you to ensure that the requirements of both plans are met. So in summary, during this presentation, we discussed the requirements of 21 CFR 117, the current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventative controls for human food. And we discussed 21 CFR 121, mitigation strategies to protect food against intentional adulteration regulation. We discussed the similarities and differences between both plans. We also discussed the methodologies used to conduct the assessments of both plans. And last, we discussed why it might be a hazard or the pitfalls of combining them together. Here in a moment, Simon's going to start opening up the floor for questions, so we will do those questions then. But I just want to add in just a couple of things. For those of you that might or might not be aware, here at AIB, we have a course called the Food Defense Coordinator Online. It's a new program. It's focused on the regulatory requirements for the FDA, and it may be important for you to do so that you can understand the requirements of conducting the vulnerability assessment. Another potential product that we have is we can help you by conducting gap assessments or vulnerability assessments at your facilities. So we can come to your facility, we can review your plan, we can walk your facility and coach, educate, and teach on potential gaps you have and where you might want to adjust anything. Some other things that we have is we have what's called the FDA preparedness inspection, where we can come into your facility and we act as the FDA to test your facility to see, are you ready for FDA's new type of inspections? Some of you on here may have already gone through a recent FDA inspection and understand what I'm talking about, that it's totally new. Where they used to stay in your facility one day, now they're staying 5 days. A lot of our customers that have gone through this type of inspection already, they're nicknaming it an FDA preventative control inspection. So anyways, these are some of the products that we have that can assist, and there's many, many more, but I'm not a salesman, so I'm not gonna go through them all. But I do wanna say thank you. Here at AIB, we really do enjoy working with all of our customers and hopefully new customers on food safety and food defense requirements. And if you're interested and you have any questions, please reach out to the link attached to this slide, which is info@aibonline.org, or you can call our number at 800-633-5137 if you have any questions, either related to food defense or food safety.
Okay, thanks for that, Earl. You can stop sharing now and switch webcam on. And there have been a lot of comments and questions throughout, but some of the members actually were answering the questions and providing links and all sorts. So I've no idea where we're up to. So we'll start again. So let's see. Ernest, yes, we're providing the recording and slides afterwards by email. Scott has mentioned, it's a bit of a challenge, I don't know, it's quite a long one. To me, this didn't clarify anything on how and who you are preventing against. Is it a Breaking Bad PhD person who knows the whole system, or a barely literate person? Is it a person that knows how to get microbes, or a person that doesn't seem to know how to wash their hands?
So Scott, that's a really good question. Now, from GFSI and food defense here, what you're looking for is similar. You're really trying to focus within your processing step where someone can reach out and touch product. It doesn't matter how much knowledge they have or how little knowledge they have, but both requirements are you have to consider that these things can be done by somebody inside of your facility, such as like a disgruntled employee or maybe even a contractor. So these individuals that might be in your facility might have a little bit more knowledge than, say, Joe walking off the street and being able to get inside your door and go do something. So yeah, we need to look at that potential that that person might have a lot of knowledge or a little bit. But in general, your food defense program is going to be based on how can I limit access if I've observed a significant vulnerability. I'll give an example. At bulk liquid receiving, the biggest hazard that's been identified is when we get that truck driver in our bulk liquid area and we open up the top of that tanker so that we can allow venting during the unloading process. Now that product is accessible. If someone's not watching the top of that tanker during the whole time the unloading is happening, or if it isn't a fully secure building and the driver's left there unalone or unattended, now that driver has an opportunity to, when we're not around, climb up to the top of that opening and add a contaminant in. So that's kind of like the perspective that you're looking at, and I hope that kind of explains a little bit better what we're talking about.
Okay, thanks, Earl. Yeah, one from Thies. Can the food safety defense plan be combined with the food fraud plan?
So it can, but truth and reality, I would consider putting the food fraud plan with my food safety plan. From the FDA standpoint, when you're looking at food fraud that could lead to a food safety issue, you're already required to combine it in the food safety plan. Now, I do know that GFSI requirements for your food fraud assessment is totally different. It's wide ranging. It's not just food safety elements, but it's things such as, are you sure that that ground beef isn't horse meat? Or are you ensuring that that honey you're getting in is not just pure honey, but could it be combined with corn syrup to thicken it up and fraud somebody? So the requirements are different. But again, this is how someone's trying to do something intentional, yes. But the point is, I'm just trying to make money. Usually the intent is not to hurt anybody. They just want to make that profit and you not know that they've actually done a fraud event. So in my personal opinion, I would consider not putting it with food defense, but I would put it with my food safety plan.
Okay, thanks. Ernest, are AIB developing a food fraud vulnerability course, or have you got one?
Actually, that's a good question. We are working on that development now. So we are almost through with our development phase. We still have to go through the test phase. So stay tuned. Now, a little birdie told me that we're looking at possibly holding our first course in maybe as early as October. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's the birdie's goal. I don't know where it's going to be held at, but it's going to be a public event. So stay tuned and sign up for it when it comes out.
Okay, great. And Ernest asked another question. Will AIB make the Food Defense Coordinator certification course in a printed format?
I'm not sure what's meant by that. I know we have the online course where you can do it individually. And then we also offer this as a public course or even a private course. So we can come to your facility and just be facility specific. Now, when you are a participant for our public or private course, you have the option of getting the printed materials, because we do offer the printed participants guide and the handouts and stuff, or getting these materials electronically. So now you already have them on your computer. So I hope that's what you meant, Ernest.
Okay. Irina, what are the possible emergency steps in the food industry for a case when all staff have food poisoning? Slightly off topic, I think, but can you help with that?
I might be able to. So now this is something that I have noticed. I've been consulting with the industry and helping out. And I know some facilities have those cafeterias or cantinas that are located within where your employees have the ability to purchase lunch there. So I'm going to use that as a potential scenario. Even though this portion is not required to be covered underneath FDA because FDA is worried about customer, not retail. However, it could be a risk if your kitchen staff that's making that food for your employees to purchase, they could intentionally adulterate. So you want to look at that potential. If there is a potential for that, maybe you now require that contractor or whoever's running your kitchen to develop a plan themselves, and you guys review it to help minimize that potential impact. So I hope you also might want to consider, when you're doing massive office events like barbecues or dinners, that maybe scrutinizing your vendors you're getting that from and how they move that product from their facility to wherever you're having the event, to minimize the potential of mass food poisoning and such like that.
Okay, thanks, Earl. Christos is asking, how are freighters affected by the food defense plan? Are they responsible for their own activities, or will the companies be the only accountables for transport?
So that's a good question. So most of you might be aware that in the States, there is a Sanitary Transport Act under FSMA, which basically does hold the transportation or freighters with some responsibility when it comes to food safety. However, the responsibility is defined by the entity that's required to ship the product. So if I am a maker of widgets and I'm going to ship those widgets out, I need to tell that freighter company what they need to do to keep my product safe, and then they're required to develop processes and procedures and conduct training for their employees. Food defense is kind of not underneath that. So when you're doing your own food defense plans, it's only when that product touches your door where you start receiving your ingredients until it goes out your door. But in most cases, when you're making products such as, say, canned goods or something like that, it's leaving your facility triply protected. So you got a box, and then you got a can, and then you might have individual packages. So the likelihood of intentional adulteration occurring that's going to cause that wide scale type potential is almost non-existent, because that person receiving that product, if they see the package is damaged, they're probably not going to accept it. So that's kind of why the FDA didn't make it a requirement for freighters to kind of control anything.
Okay, very good. Jan took the AIB Food Defense Coordinator class in 2002. Oh, 16 years ago. Wow. Is it the same, or is there changes?
So Jan, there are major changes from that program. So what you took back in 2002 was current industry requirements, best practices. Now our course is really focused on meeting FDA requirements. However, like I mentioned earlier, even though we focus it to FDI, it also will help you meet those GFSI requirements, because they are really similar. Now, if you're current and you're looking at recertifying, every year we produce 2-hour webinars that have the newest updated information. So for instance, if you're recertifying this year, you can go and watch 2 webinars. One is a 1-hour webinar on basically a condensed version of the requirements of the new regulation and what we need to do. And the second webinar is some prerequisite programs that might be important for food defense and how to develop those. So I hope that answers your question, that the new online course is not the same, but we do have a way to capture, if you become a certified individual, that when you recertify, you can get that new information and stay up to date.
Right, brilliant. Rocky's asking about the fee structure, but I guess there's a variety of courses. You're better off looking at the AIB website, I guess, for pricing.
Absolutely. Or if you really have some specific information, just send that question to info@aibonline.org, and our individuals at the office will send you all the information you could ever ask for, and it'll be pretty quickly too.
Okay, great. And SG, in audits, sometimes the auditors are aware of the possible hazards in the facility, even though the company is SF HACCP certified. I'm just wondering that why auditors neglect these hazards. On what basis do they pass the audits?
Okay, so I can only speak on what we do at AIB, and I'm going to focus on our GMP audits that we do. So when we do an audit and we review your plan, your hazard analysis or your HACCP plan, we're not judging it. We're just looking to see, are you meeting the requirements? So did you assess all of those hazards that you're required to? How did you include EMA in your assessment? How did you include looking at radiological hazards? And if you identified significant hazards, did you develop preventative controls? And then, of course, we would review, are you following them? The beauty about the requirements of the FDA is that there's nothing regulated. So you might have identified a food safety hazard or say a food defense hazard, but the FDA does not say, if you have this hazard, you have to do this. A facility can choose many different ways to control it. So when we review food safety plans or food defense plans, we're just seeing, does it make sense? And then whatever you wrote down, are you following it? We don't judge whether you're wrong or right on how you assess the plan. Now, we might educate, or we might say you might want to consider, but we would never score anything unless you're really missing the requirements of the regulation.
Okay, super. Thanks for the clarification. Vivian, how to keep the food defense plan confidential if it's being audited by GFSI or requested by a customer? Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned food safety plan is available versus food defense not available to the public. So what are your thoughts on that?
So this is good. So a lot of you in the past always have been doing really good on having a basic vulnerability assessment that doesn't show a lot of things. I've seen some facilities have a checklist. I've seen some facilities that have a rough statement that says, we've done this, we've captured this, and we've done this. I would initially try to share that with a GFSI auditor. I would also reach out to your scheme owner, whether it's SQF or BRC, and just ask, let them know your concerns and find out what you can show them to show that you're meeting those requirements, but not sharing those secrets that's important to your facility. That's what I would recommend.
Okay. Stacy has just said also, we have customers request our food defense plan. Yeah. Okay. Laurie, in another webinar I attended, it was mentioned that the current food defense plan builder did not meet the requirements required for a food defense plan under FSMA. Is this also AIB's opinion?
So it's not even AIB's opinion, but I do agree with that. FDA has stated it on numerous occasions. The current food defense plan builder does not meet the regulatory requirements of their rule. Now, they are working diligently to update it to meet those requirements. If you are out there and you are using the current food defense plan builder, just make sure that you meet all the requirements. However, they say that when they get the updated version, which I know is going to be up soon before the compliance date hits for the big ones, the information you already have in it is supposed to be able to automatically transfer over to the newer one. So you didn't waste your time if you're using the old one, but currently, right now, it doesn't meet regulatory requirements. However, it may meet GFSI current requirements. So, especially from FSSC standpoint, they even say that it is a good vulnerability assessment you can use to cover the requirements. So again, regulatory, no, the current one doesn't meet, but GFSI, it might.
Okay. Irina, in case a step had a high risk, e.g. water storage in the food defense plan, after the review, considering historical data, can it become a middle or low risk if nothing happened?
So yeah, you bring up a great concept. So when I'm evaluating a processing step, say like a bulk liquid storage tank, just remember though, yes, historically you are looking at, has water ever been, intentionally adulterated before and those kind of things. But when you're reviewing a processing step, you need to keep in mind that if you do have control, say like you already have a lock at the top of the tank, when you're doing the assessment, you need to pretend that that measure is not there, because more than likely that measure will become your mitigation strategy. You'll just have to formalize it more often. Now, what I encourage facilities to do is reevaluate where they use locks. If I have a storage tank and say the top of my hatch is locked, but I rarely get into it, something you might want to consider doing is having maintenance come along and bolt it down. We can still get in it when we need to, so we can use a special tool to open it up, but now in general, it's not accessible. So now the risk rating can be dropped lower because now I don't need a lock and it's not going to be a mitigation strategy because it's just not accessible.
Makes sense, yeah. Okay. Okay, Alicia, does the FDA have a list of the gaps posted somewhere?
Okay, so this is also a good question. They really don't have a list of gaps, but they do have a very useful tool that can help you when you're looking at mitigation strategies. They have what's called the FDA Mitigation Strategies Database. So when you're doing your assessment, if you find a vulnerability, but you can't figure out what you can do to reduce the potential, you can go on this website and this database, and you can type in a processing step, say bulk liquid unloading, and you can hit enter, and you're going to see, like, for bulk liquid unloading, about 6 or 7 pages of options of potential mitigation strategies you could use. Now, these are only recommendations, they're not requirements. So it isn't that you have to use these, but what I always encourage facilities is, if you're struggling, look at it. You might be able to see a couple of things that get your brain going, oh, that makes sense. I didn't even think that that could be a mitigation strategy. So I can take this piece here and this one, combine it, and this will work. And I can show that it's going to reduce the potential. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I'm sure it does, Earl. Right, on that note, we'll call it a day. I think we've picked through all the questions. If there are any further questions, just send them over. And Earl said that he will follow up with those if we've missed any. Great. Thanks very much, Earl, for your time today, for the presentation, and also for answering the attendees' questions. It's great to have you, and I hope you'll be back on another webinar very soon.
Thank you, Simon. As always, it's always a pleasure to work with IFSQN, and I look forward to any opportunity.
Brilliant. All right. Have a nice weekend, Earl, and I'll see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Cheers. Bye. Ladies and gents, that was Earl Arnold from AIB International. We'll issue the slides and the recording afterwards. The slides will include all the contact details, so if you have any questions about any of those courses mentioned, training courses, just get in touch with them. I've already loaded the certificate in the sidebar, so you should be able to download that. It's Friday. Yes, bye-bye. Another good webinar, 95. Next week, we've got George Howlett from Safe Food 360, and the topic is the fundamental principles of food safety, understanding the link between hazard, risk, and control. So hope you'll join us then. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.